Hey, it's Mike here, and today we're talking about the label of healthy on food products according to the FDA, as well as the FDA's new proposal to change what is healthy. We're going to be looking at what foods will now magically become healthy with their change, and which ones will be snubbed and no longer healthy. It's over for you. And this has various health food industries either up in arms or celebrating, and it is a mixed bag because the end result of this, as with the intention to start it, is that less packaged foods are going to be able to be named healthy, labeled as healthy, which is going to be improvement. But then there's also some that are being snubbed from the label healthy, which I think are ridiculous, and just a lot of things we need to investigate. In particular, what has happened with eggs here, because for the first time in history, modern history, it's going to make it onto the list of healthy. We have a really interesting industry-laden little story there that we'll cover. Let's just go. For some background, I almost don't need to say that the US is notorious for having a bunch of bogus labels. I mean, in the past, healthy has been able to be put on some ridiculous foods. Also, natural as a label is quite ridiculous and can be used on everything, and people have always mistook it for organic. And then don't even get me started on like sustainably caught fish and pasture raised and grass fed and all that stuff. That's for another time. But with actually being able to put the term healthy on a food on the shelves in stores, we can look to the FDA's previous definition, which actually came out in 1994. Quote, the existing definition has limits for total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium, and qualified foods must also provide at least 10% of the daily value for one or more of the following nutrients: vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, iron, protein, and fiber. However, later last year in 2022, the FDA came out with a proposal to change this. And I'm going to be honest, it went a little bit under my radar. I talked to a bunch of people about this. They are not familiar with it. And while it was covered a few months back in the news, it has recently been spotlighted in a Washington Post article, which has gotten it a lot more attention. And yeah, a lot of major food companies are fighting back. ConAgra, which is like when you see that giant spider web diagram of all the food companies that own all the other food companies. Yeah, they're closer to the top. And they say it's against their First Amendment right to be able to say things are healthy. Yes, they need the right to say that Cheese Whiz is a health food. And what's the motivation here? Well, just that people in the US are still eating horribly with that current definition of healthy on labels. So changing it's going to fix all that. No, well, from the FDA, the Health and Human Services Secretary says that the goal is really to lower our risk of chronic disease because too many people may not know what constitutes healthy food, and that the FDA's move will help educate more Americans to improve health outcomes, tackle health disparities, and save lives, one healthy word at a time. Now let's get to some of the new rules, and perhaps the most basic is one that is hitting all these processed foods pretty hard, and that is, quote, a food product would need to contain a certain amount of food from at least one of the food groups or subgroups. You know, fruits, vegetables, grains, dairy, and protein foods recommended in the 20 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. Yeah, that's a pretty low bar. Just like be an actual food. That's where we're at in the US. And thankfully, quote, raw whole fruits and vegetables would automatically qualify for the, quote, healthy claim because of their nutrient profile and positive contribution to an overall healthy diet. And that's good. You know, these are already foods that were obviously healthy. However, one that couldn't be advertised as healthy previously was the avocado because it had too much total fat, even though those are some pretty darn healthy fats in there. But now avocados can be healthy and feel good about themselves. No more avo shaming. Anyway, now to the specific limits. The specific limits for added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium would be based on a percentage of daily value for these nutrients. And another annoying thing here is that they admit that 5% of the daily value of saturated fat per reference amount customarily consumed, more or less the servings that people actually eat, should be the cutoff for foods in general, which would be a major problem for animal products like eggs and meat. But then they make an exception and double that to 10% saturated fat for dairy, meat, and eggs. And Kind bars are freaking out because apparently they're gonna fail. And it is the case that every time I turn one of those over, it's more and more like a Snickers bar. And the line of healthy choice frozen meals, which make up a large portion of all of the foods that are advertised as healthy with that word on their label, they're gonna be screwed. And for a pretty shocking one, due to being in a weird spot of being like a dried out food, which kind of counts as processing here, Spices aren't going to qualify, which has the spice makers all up in arms, which they should be. I mean, some of the healthiest foods on the planet, like oregano, which is super high in antioxidants, wouldn't be allowed to be considered a healthy food. That's ridiculous, and I really hope that changes. But let's compare the before and after of those limits from the 1994 healthy rules that we have to the proposed ones. Here they are side by side. What is missing in the bottom proposed ones? Well, notice that cholesterol is no longer there. Why not? We're going to investigate. And we can start that investigation with just witnessing the egg industry celebrating here from a egg company. They say, after decades of undercooked and antiquated guidance, the FDA has finally proposed a revision to food labeling requirements to allow eggs to be labeled as healthy. That's right, the FDA officially agrees that eggs are a healthy, nutrient-dense food. And yes, to verify it with the actual National Archives proposal by the FDA, yeah, it does appear that they include eggs as a food that falls within a healthy dietary pattern here. And they say specifically, if you read more, that eggs are included. And we'll get into that logic because it's very interesting. Now, for those of you that are food experts that do follow what eggs can or can't be labeled at, there are probably some bells going off in your head because there has been a history of the egg industry being shot down when trying to advertise eggs as healthy or nutritious. It was not allowed, and that is so well exposed by the Freedom of Information Act request by nutritionfacts.org, which shows the dialogue between the USDA's head of poultry research and promotion and the egg board, saying that because eggs have the amount of cholesterol they do, the words healthy and nutritious are problematic. They're just not allowed. And I do think it's really important to quickly go over this historic saga of this back and forth between cholesterol claims by the egg board and them trying to influence the USDA and dietary guidelines over different iterations of them over time. And let's frame this all with some recent claims from the egg board. For those of you that don't know, the egg board is a checkoff, which is essentially really a government marketing arm of an industry. Anyway, here they say, quote, "This new proposed definition aligns with current scientific research and the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans by removing the limit on dietary cholesterol, which is no longer considered a nutrient of public health concern." This is probably one of the slimiest, runniest, rotten claims that the egg board has made. And they're the ones that were also caught making, at least joking about death threats for the creator of Just Mayo. Of course, an egg-free competitor of your Eggy Mayo. And this is slimy because, well, the recent dietary guidelines didn't have a particular number slapped on cholesterol as a limit. There is absolutely no way that it is not a nutrient of concern, as I will prove to you. But first, let's look back to that history. Just back to 2005, we see that we did actually have a specific 300 milligram cholesterol per day limit that was listed. And that was clearly very bad for the egg industry, as they are major sources of cholesterol. An egg has like 180 milligrams of cholesterol in it. And so, of course, they were putting pressure on the USDA, and they did actually, by 2015, get them to cave and use the language they wanted, which is that cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of public concern. However, that got snubbed, and that was largely thanks to the lawsuit by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And that really exposed the connection, they say, according to their documents that they obtained. The American Egg Board had nominated one individual placed on the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Committee. A second member was actively receiving egg industry research grants, according to industry documents, and two other worked at a university that had requested and received more than $100,000 from the American Egg Board for research aimed at challenging the cholesterol limits. This was designed from the ground up. The industry hold is no yoke. Oh, you can stop watching. I deserve it after that. But it is amazing to think at how little money you actually need. Like, we're talking about a single family home worth of money in the US to put a large amount of influence and potentially change the guidelines for what 300 million people eat. But thankfully, and probably really largely due to the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, they shot down that nutrient of concern thing and ended up going with the final 2015 guidelines, which told Americans to, quote, eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible in terms of heart health. So egg industry lost that battle, but they kept fighting. They kept going. So what about the newest guidelines? Remember, they used those to vindicate that cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern anymore and that eggs are healthy. Well, looking to page 44 of those guidelines themselves, it says that, quote, the National Academies recommends dietary cholesterol consumption to be as low as possible without compromising the nutritional adequacy of the diet, and that this is consistent with those 2015 dietary guidelines to consume as little dietary cholesterol as possible. I mean, imagine someone being like, yeah, my parole officer told me to lower my crack intake as much as possible, but clearly it's not actually a drug of concern to them. Like, that's the same logic they're using. So cholesterol clearly is still a nutrient of concern from the most recent guidelines. The egg industry is just spreading those rotten sulfurous lies. But I do think they wiggled right into the crack within these guidelines here, because there's nowhere where it says, eat as little cholesterol as possible. This is what we're telling you right now. It just talks about, various government agencies clearly echoing that it's of concern at least, but they use that to say it's not in there at all. No concern. That's wrong. And this is where things get interesting, because we have to ask, how does a statement like that about cholesterol translate into the FDA saying they used the guidelines to determine that eggs should be considered healthy? This is where things get frustrating, because from the proposal by the FDA, they say that, we could take cholesterol off because generally saturated fat foods have cholesterol in them as well. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1. In particular, that the saturated fat rule will disqualify most foods that contain more than 60 milligrams of cholesterol, showing that that's a cutoff that they want. However, their logic completely breaks down by saying that because there are some nutrients in eggs, the high cholesterol, that's just completely okay. We're just going to accept that randomly based off no influence from any industry. By this same logic, a sugar-laden orange Julius should be considered a healthy food because it has vitamin C. And this is where things get really cyclical, because they say that eggs, as well as high cholesterol seafood, we're talking like shrimp, have nutrients, and that they were mentioned in the guidelines as part of a healthy dietary pattern, so they must be healthy. And this is the area where the egg industry certainly has almost won the war, I would say, because looking to the dietary guidelines, again, yes, eggs are included in that healthy dietary pattern. But within that quote-unquote healthy pattern, you can wiggle a lot. And there's an example with eggs here, looking to the guidelines for, adults 18 to 30 and the amount of protein foods that you should eat. If you favor eggs and just decide to eat eggs here, well, then you can eat 3.5 eggs every single day, which is nearly 700 milligrams of cholesterol each day, which is very much against the notion of keeping dietary cholesterol as low as possible. And that would still be very much within their healthy diet. And the problem here is that if you deem a food healthy, they aren't strolling down the grocery store aisle with a PDF printout calculating the exact amount of grams of protein foods to make sure that they don't eat too much cholesterol from eggs or whatever food. No, that's not practical. Eggs have been deemed a green light food, and therefore people will eat as much as they want. So the egg industry has found a back door here, if not built a back door into these guidelines, which really relies on the fallacy of begging the question. In other words, you are drawing a conclusion based off a conclusion that already exists. They're saying eggs are healthy because they are said to be healthy by the dietary guidelines, not because they actually are. Which brings us to the actual health research on eggs. The Egg Board says that, hey, there's decades of research on cholesterol, and the data shows no link between eating eggs and cardiovascular disease risk. But as PCRM, that physicians committee, pointed out, a lot of these meta-analyses are working with like 95% industry-funded research. Jeebus. But funding doesn't have to equal the wrong conclusion. Well, it is the case that they are coming to the wrong conclusion on cholesterol, which we can flesh out here. And we have a particular example highlighted on nutritionfacts.org of how the egg industry designs misleading studies. Here's a clip.
For the 7 hours after eating a meal with no fat, no cholesterol, hardly any changes at all. But now a meal with fat and more egg. Triglycerides shoot up and blood cholesterol shoots up. That's the kind of data that's bad for egg sales. So how could one design a study to hide this fact? Well, what if we only measured fasting cholesterol levels in the morning, 7 hours after supper? You wouldn't see a big difference between those that ate eggs the night before and those that didn't.
And yeah, to back up the principle of this from this paper in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology where the egg board has a little bit less influence, I'd hope, from, some atherosclerosis researchers. They say that fasting cholesterol does matter. Now, they're saying the fasting lipids are just a baseline, really what happened last night, and then you get up and eat breakfast, and for several hours, your endothelium, your artery lining, is exposed to things like sugar and cholesterol. Then you have lunch, and then you have dinner, and on, and so you're in a non-fasting state for about 18 hours of the day. And another one that is really important, they mentioned that dietary cholesterol increases LDL oxidation by about 35 to 40%, depending on the study. Not good, because that LDL oxidation is what starts those lesions in the heart, which are dangerous and cause heart attacks. So what happens when we have a study that's not funded by the egg industry, perhaps the National Institute of Health? Well, here's one in JAMA from 2019 on about 30,000 people over 17 and a half years. They say, quote, among US adults, higher consumption of dietary cholesterol or eggs was significantly associated with higher risk of incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality in a dose-response manner. And finally, those cholesterol spikes from eggs are also raising your LDL, or bad cholesterol, increasing that. And from the European Society of Cardiology, LDL is causally linked to atherosclerosis. Here, it's not just an association in the epidemiology. And finally, this is really ironic because the FDA commissioner is saying, we want to make a new rule on healthy labeling so that we can lower disease risk and death, including heart disease, yet they are changing it so that a food that drives heart disease, eggs, can now be labeled as healthy and people will eat more of it. But I don't want to just say, hey, you're doing everything wrong. Why don't we just propose some solutions that might actually have more of a benefit? First of all, how about we restrict the advertising of highly addictive, super processed foods, especially to children? We can also be a little bit more like the EU and actually regulate some more of these horrible disease-causing ingredients, which are like illegal in the rest of the world. And heck, maybe we can actually label foods that are unhealthy very clearly, which does work, as they did in Chile, where they put little stop signs on foods that had high saturated fat or sugar, etc. And from this study, they found that pretty quickly there was a 1/4 decrease in sugary drink purchases. So again, in the end, if this proposal goes through, eggs for the first time in modern history will be allowed to be labeled as healthy, yet nothing about eggs have changed. They've pointed to the dietary guidelines as saying they're healthy, but the dietary guidelines is still mentioning all this stuff about cholesterol being as low as possible. Why is that in there if they don't actually care? Because cholesterol still is a nutrient of concern. It is still, associated with increased heart disease risk and on and on. So yeah, if this proposal goes through, it appears that the egg industry will have won this battle, but the American people's health will have lost, and of course, the chickens and all those egg-laying hens who are treated horribly will also have lost. And all in the most annoying way, because cholesterol is still a nutrient of concern. The egg board literally is lying about that. So let me know down below what you think about all of this. Feel free to like and subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.